I think that's a good segue into a couple of, I guess, broader topics that, given this autonomous backstage and it's getting late at night, we can talk about, right? So let's let's dive into it. I wanted to start with space, actually, given we had a bit of a chat about space and space tech. So, Richard Branson and Elon Musk and others have blasted off into space, and world's in pandemic, uh, lockdowns everywhere. These guys are flying around in space. They might even move to one of the new planets they discover. Who knows, right? What is space? Is space kind of? I'm just going to play devil's advocate here, right? So is space like a rich man's thing? That's just a nice project for them to be doing, and while the rest of us hang out here trying to save Earth, or is it actually something that's about advancing humanity? Ciaran Hennessy.
Yeah, I think, yes, and yes, right?
That's not an answer.
I know it's not an answer. Let's go yes for a given value of yes. I think the bit which is really interesting, right? And yes, it's a lot about the ego of the guys, right? Because, Branson, Elon and Jeff they're all that sort of person, right? But I think one of the things that it's hard to argue with is the amount of sort of meaningful technological changes that come out of space exploration, right? You even look at, the initial sort of space missions really accelerated, the development of, microelectronics, the development of solar technology, even advancements in the way that, you treat and manufacture and, preserve food. So, one of the things that's really interesting about space is it gives you this opportunity to sort of experiment in that, that sort of isolated zone, right? It's hard to sort of meaningfully experiment on Earth because you've got all these other factors, right? So, there's weather and there's people and there's stuff. And this environment where you can come up with these crazy ideas and try them out. But, there's also this classic sort of moonshot mentality around space travel as well. So, how everyone talks about, these moonshot things that you do in the world of, tech startups. And it's literally about that, thinking about an impossible mission and then working out the way to get there. I think that mentality and that drive that sort of comes out of these type of organizations is really important to lots of other things as well. Because if you don't have that sort of anything's possible attitude, a lot of other things just don't get thought about. And I mean, it's that famously that apocryphal quote that's always, applied to Henry Ford, which is if I asked someone what they wanted, they'd say a better horse. And I mean, it's sort of the same thing when you think about space travel, right? Because for most people, when you go, oh, space travel, I don't really like it. How's it going to affect me? I'm never going to afford to be a space traveler. But then you sort of go, well, there's the thing those Michelle talked about where you go, well, how about being able to contact anywhere on the planet, on the face of the planet, because we've got this geosynchronous orbit of satellites which help to connect us together, or being able to cheaply manufacture solar arrays, or God say for those of us who grew up in a certain decade, being able to have Tang on the table, which was originally developed for the US astronauts to have vitamin C supplements. So all of these sort of things. Yeah, that was what Tang was for.
Yeah, I guess I look at this. I look at space in terms of three categories. One is experience, so that's all about getting on that rocket and seeing space. So I heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but Katy Perry gave her ex-partner a $200,000 odd ticket to go on space, and he didn't go. I'm like, yes, please, I'd love to go, but he didn't go. But well, that's if you want to believe celebrity news. So. We're in COVID. We're in.
I haven't received my latest issue of Hello magazine.
Yeah, well, go. Let me know what they say. So there's the experience layer, and I don't know how foreseeable it will be in certainly in my lifetime about going there affordably. But then what I am excited about is then the other layers. One is that prototyping and testing. And so last year at Autonomous Building Summit, we heard from Monty Roman, a scientist in NASA, and she was talking about the way in which they are testing how to use different materials on the moon as they're building out accommodation for astronauts on the moon, and then also what will that also then look like when they start to build on Mars? That just set my propeller geek propellers off, because it was like, whoa, here we are, and we're actually testing materials. We're testing different ways of sustainability. We're testing different ways in which buildings operate in quite extreme circumstances. If you think about Mars and the heat involved in building for there. So there's that prototyping aspect, which is going to change our world in our lifetime. And then there's the data aspect, and here's all this data that they're capturing, and it was once only a few satellites in our space realm. Now it's thousands, if not, and that will keep growing over time as we start looking at all the types of data we can capture from space. And so you look at space, which was meant to be our last frontier. Property is going to benefit from all of this space technology.
That's a great assessment.
I'm excited.
And that's the other point, right?
I'm up for it. Yes.
And that's the other point. And I know that Elon Musk talks about this quite a bit, right? But with the latest findings about how, and not trying to bring it down, but with how quickly the environment is actually degenerating here, right? There is in the back of the mind, right, is do we need that plan B, right? And all of the work that goes into space exploration and all the things that Michelle's talking about, right? Trying to experiment on, is it even potentially possible to have habitable sort of, places on other parts of our, current solar system? It becomes more important as we get more news about, how the environment's deteriorating, right? And it's one of those things that, you sort of start to think about when your kids are, getting a little bit older as well, and you're wondering, well, what sort of environment are we going to be leaving behind for these? And is the type of work that's happening in, space exploration and experimentation and all these things, is that something which is sort of like a necessary step to sort of thinking about that plan B?
It's almost a defense mechanism, right?
And if anything, the one thing you can always say about the human race, right, is we're infinitely adaptable to our environment, right? And if you're like me and you read a lot of terrible 1970s science fiction, there's another fact about me. All of them.
I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, good.
I never would have guessed.
All of them sort of talk about, how, at a point in time, humanity needs to think about like habitation, right? Like, how do you spread the load? And, not trying to drag it back to property again as well, but like when you sort of think about property, like part of it's not about how do you jam as many people into one space as possible. And, like being able to think about, well, what if you could spread, the population across, multiple locations, right? Like what if you could have, a secondary sort of habitation, on the moon or Mars or one of the other planets, which is a little bit, adaptable to our environment? What would that sort of look like? How would like humanity work where you have Earth people and Moon people, right? It's really interesting sort of concept to think about. And it's definitely something like, if you would have said to me, 20 years ago or whatever, that you'd be able to have a microcomputer, 10,000 times more powerful than the one that sent people to moon in a watch on my wrist, I would have said, I don't think that's going to happen, right? And I think people underestimate the Moore's law on how rapidly technology makes the impossible possible. And it's really interesting when you look at that.
It is very interesting. And there's a couple of reflections here. The first is, I think, it's interesting the private sector is driving the path to space at the moment, right? So if you reflect back to the era when President Kennedy said those fateful words, he outlined the case why we should put a man on the moon. And the reason was because that is the next frontier, and as human beings, we are going to go through. And there was a sense of the president is saying that we can do this. But these days, there isn't that type of leadership anymore. There isn't a President Kennedy anymore. It's the private sector that is driving this innovation. And I just wonder whether that is enough to necessarily take the world with you. And a couple of reflections here, because you look at the innovation that has gone into the development of the COVID vaccines, right? Both the AstraZeneca, the Pfizer, the Moderna vaccine, mRNA vaccines, and the other type of vaccine. That was done within 12 months of the pandemic starting, right? And of course, there's other ones too. 12 months. It is the least recognized thing that our health care sector managed to go into deep innovation and develop a solution to a global pandemic within 12 months. And I think about in a lost era, that would have been seen as a great feat of human ingenuity. And right now, instead of that, we're having a debate about whether the vaccine is safe or not the fact that it's saving lives. So I wonder on the space thing, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, well, we've got the rich guys, they've flown off to space. Are they going to move to the moon and leave all the rest of us here?
I think without sounding too, Brave New World / utopian, I think the value that private enterprises bring is that they're very sort of focused on the value part of any type of transaction, right? So most private enterprises understand where the money is, and sometimes advancements have to work sort of in a vacuum where there's a value transfer. When sort of like the US government was, sort of thinking about going to the moon and stuff like that, a lot of it was also driven by the space race, right? There was a military reason, right? There's no way that the US was going to allow, Russia or China or one of those other countries to get there before they did, because they were thinking about that tactical advantage. And I think as we sort of like we're rocketing through this, 21st century, which is horribly going very quickly, I think you're finding this new sort of type of company evolving as well. So, the companies of the past in the private sector were very, companies that were driven, financial institutions and banks and, manufacturing companies and all these things. But there's this interesting new type of company, which is sort of rising out of the ashes of the 2000s, where they still understand how to make money, but they have more overt social consciences, if that's a way to sort of talk about it. And they're driven by different things now. I mean, if you sort of look at Elon Musk's set of companies, right? He really makes his money out of sort of one of them, right? And a lot of the other ones are just about trying to understand if there's new products in that space, right? So, his tunnel company makes no money, right? I mean, they spend a lot of money sending flamethrowers out to people, which if I can ever get my hands on one of those, I'd be very interested, but I'm pretty sure I think he only made
a certain amount of flamethrowers.
And, you look at SpaceX, I mean, SpaceX doesn't make any money. I mean, there's a lot of patents and there's a lot of technologies which come out of it, which might be commercialized later, but it doesn't make any money. And it works pretty closely with NASA. I mean, it's effectively NASA's, third-party contractor for building.
It's funded by government. SpaceX is funded by government. So effectively, it's a contracted-out model.
Exactly. And I think even though there's danger in letting private enterprise drive things, because, they're driven by different models, right, to governments. But I think the era of governments making big, huge sort of transformational changes to the world is probably waning, is my opinion.
I agree. I mean, it's a good point. Sorry, Michelle, my apologies. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Silicon Valley, you look at Silicon Valley, it arose from a collaboration between academia, private, and government. It was about a really wonderful university saying, hey, we're developing this talent, but we need to create jobs as well, and we have a social responsibility. You look at space, that is completely a collaboration, again, between academia, between industry, between government. And then you'll hear stories through Autonomous 21 where Singapore are doing some really wonderful things in terms of their digitization and the acceleration of industry, again, through that collaboration. And then you look at Mind and, back to my favorite project, Mind is again all about how do you bring academia and government, etc., together. And so I actually think it's not private sector leading, it's not government sector leading. Where the magic truly comes is when you have the three entities collaborating together to achieve something that is bigger than themselves, something like sustainability, something like economic prosperity, something like wellness.
That's a really interesting insight.
The COVID vaccine is a great example of that, right? Because the mRNA technology that a lot of the vaccines are based on has been being developed for 20, 30 years, right? Collaboratively across a couple of universities. And the only reason that a lot of the companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca were able to actually put it into practice so quickly was because of the collaboration with those universities. So a lot of the fundamental technology that was sort of, based around how those vaccines were put together had already been proven outright, which is actually why I get really annoyed when people go on about how did they, they don't work, this one works, right? It's proven, peer validated, technology that's been around for at least 2 decades. It's the application which is new. And, this is one of the things where you get smart people in universities coming up with, really interesting concepts and methodologies. And then you have people in private enterprise who understand how to create products. And then you bring those two together, and that's where you get that magic.
No, again, it's a good point, and I think it's interesting from a Lend-Lease perspective. I mean, that's really what we do for a living. We partner with government into development of cities and the development of new part of cities and development of precincts, right? And a lot of it is traditional real estate, where we take a part of a city and we create it into something new in terms of built form. And where we're going is to try and integrate a whole digital element and digital overlay of that to make that a better experience for people on the ground. I think that's where this view on space, I think you're right, Ciaran, as ridiculous as it sounds, the innovation that comes out of space actually does help with that, because it helps us think about how to operate better on the ground if we learn things and experiment with things in space. So, all right, lots to discuss there. So let's go to another one. Let's go to the Olympics.